In 1979, Dr. Rike Gerd-Hamer was diagnosed with testicular cancer. The cancer diagnosis came at a very difficult time during Dr. Hamer's life, because just a few months before he was diagnosed with cancer, Dr. Hamer's son Dirk died as a result of a tragic accident. Dr. Hamer was always a healthy man. He was never seriously ill. So he immediately wondered whether his cancer could be related to the emotional stress and the emotional pain that he was suffering over the loss of his son. At this time of his life, Dr. Hamer was head internist at a cancer clinic in Germany. So he was working with cancer patients. And he started to talk to his patients. He wanted to find out if his patients, his cancer patient, had also experienced some emotional trauma before they got cancer. And he quickly learned that all of them, without exception, had suffered what we call in German new medicine a conflict shock before they got cancer. But this, however, did not explain why Dr. Hamer's patients, and including himself, developed a very specific type of cancer. Why testicular cancer? Why breast cancer? Why colon cancer? Why lung cancer? And Dr. Hamer was determined to find out. And he had an ingenious idea. Based on the premise that all our bodily processes are controlled from our brain, Dr. Hamer obtained a brain scan of all his cancer patients. A brain scan, we have an example here, shows layers of the brain taken parallel to the base of the cranium. And Dr. Hamer compared the brain scan with his patients' medical records and their personal history. And he took particular attention to his patients' recent emotional trauma. And this is what Dr. Hamer found. Dr. Hamer found, and we're going to do this slowly, Dr. Hamer found that each cancer has its own area in the brain from where the cancer is controlled. And each cancer is linked to a very specific type of conflict shock that correlates psychologically and biologically to the same area in the brain that controls the cancer. So in other words, Dr. Hamer found a clear correlation between certain conflicts, how these conflicts manifest themselves on the organ level as cancer, and how all this is connected to the brain. So he found, for example, that lung cancer is always controlled from a very specific area in the brain stem, which is the oldest part of the brain, and that lung cancer is always linked to a death fright conflict. Glandular breast cancer, so a cancer in the breast glands, on the other hand, is always controlled from a very specific area in the so-called cerebellum, which is just next to the brainstem. And glandular breast cancer is always caused by, as Dr. Hamer calls it, a nest worry conflict. So unexpected concern and worries about the well-being of a loved one. Intraductal breast cancer, on the other hand, he found is always controlled from a very specific area in the so-called cerebrum. And intraductal breast cancer is always caused, so he found, by a separation conflict. Well, animals, aren't they wonderful? Animals experience these conflicts in real terms. For example, when they're separated from their mate, from their offspring, when they are attacked by an opponent, when they lose their nest or their territory, when they suffer a threat of starvation or a death fright. While we humans developed over time a figurative way of thinking, so we can suffer these conflicts in a transposed sense. So we can experience such conflict, for example, territorial conflict, when we lose our home or our workplace. We can suffer an attack conflict when we are physically attacked, verbally attacked, or when our integrity is attacked. We can suffer a starvation conflict when we don't know how to provide for ourselves. And we can suffer a death fright conflict most often, and a typical death fright is a diagnosis shock. And Dr. Hammer found, or as we would say, since this conflict involves our entire organism, so the psyche, the brain, and the organ, and since we share these conflicts with all other species, we speak in German New Medicine of biological conflicts rather than of psychological conflicts. Well, after Dr. Hammer has identified what type of conflicts cause what type of cancer, he naturally looked at other so-called diseases. He looked at heart conditions, skin disorders, liver disorders, diabetes, arthritis, and so forth. But he also looked at mood disorders like depression, or mental disorders, as we call it, bipolar disorders. And Dr. Hammer found that this interplay, that this interaction between the psyche, the brain, and the organ applies to all of medicine and each patient's case. And Dr. Hammer called his findings the 5 biological laws of the new medicine. Dr. Hammer called them biological law because his discoveries reveal universal biological principles that apply to every living organism, to every species, and to every human being. Dr. Hammer calls his discoveries biological laws because these biological laws reveal that diseases are not, as we assumed, the result of a malfunctioning organism, but that diseases are instead meaningful biological processes which are comprehensible in the context of our evolution and how our organism developed over time. And the 5 biological laws also reveal that diseases are curable. Firmly tied into the science of embryology, Dr. Hammer provides the scientific evidence that we are all born with the capability to heal our own diseases, that the healing of cancer and all other diseases is inherent in all of us. And this implies, my friends, that we do no longer have to fear diseases, that we do no longer have to panic when we get cancer, because, as Dr. Hammer puts it so well, many of us will at one time or another experience a conflict and get cancer. But that is a normal part of life and not such a bad thing at all, once one understands the principles of the 5 biological laws. And we're going to look into those laws now. Okay, the first biological law states that every disease originates from a conflict shock that catches us completely off guard. So this is already important information, because such a conflict shock is an emotionally unexpected emotional distress, an unexpected emotional distress for which we are not prepared and which we could not anticipate. And as such, this conflict shock differs greatly from everyday stress or emotional stress that we can foresee. Dr. Hammer calls this conflict shock, this unexpected conflict shock, a DHS, which stands for Dirk-Hammer syndrome. He called it a DHS, obviously, in honor of his son Dirk, whose tragic death was the cause why Dr. Hammer himself developed cancer. So let's see how this plays out in details. The moment we suffer such a conflict shock, the conflict shock impacts in a very specific, in fact, in a predetermined area in the brain. And we see on a brain scan the impact of this shock as a set of sharp concentric rings. The location, so in other words, where exactly in the brain the conflict hits or impacts, is determined by the nature of the conflict. So if we learned already a little bit, a separation conflict always impacts in a very specific area in the so-called cerebrum, while a death-fright conflict always impacts in a specific area in the old brain, specifically in the brain stem. How does this play out on the organ level? Well, the moment the brain receives the conflict shock, the shock is instantly communicated to the corresponding organ, and instantly a significant biological special program is activated that assists, and I underline, that assists our organism in coping with the particular conflict situation. So in other words, Dr. Hammer identified the brain as the mediator between the psyche and the body. He identified the brain as the control station from which each and every biological program is controlled and coordinated. In German New Medicine, we view the psyche, the brain, and the organ as 3 levels of one unified organism. And we will keep in mind that it is the psyche that is the driving and the leading component of that program. Very important point. Such a conflict shock is, of course, a very subjective event. It's a very personal event. So how we perceive and experience this conflict shock is determined by our individual perception of this conflict situation, by our attitude, by our vulnerabilities, by our expectation, by our values and our beliefs. In other words, it is our subjective mode that determines how we perceive the conflict, and consequently what symptoms will manifest themselves as a result of the shock. Let's look at an example. And I'm using this example so we really understand the difference between a psychological conflict and a biological conflict. Let's say, for example, a woman is all of a sudden unexpectedly faced with the situation that her husband wants a divorce. Well, this is no doubt a separation scenario, let's call it. It is a separation scenario, but this does not necessarily mean that the woman suffers a separation conflict in biological terms. She can also perceive that situation as a loss conflict, which will involve her ovaries. She can experience the situation as a starvation conflict if she will no longer know how to provide for herself. She can suffer the conflict or experience it as an abandonment conflict, which will involve her kidneys. Or, let's say, as a self-devaluation conflict, which involves her bones. Well, whether the woman develops osteoporosis, ovarian cancer, liver cancer, or if she starts gaining weight when an abandonment conflict is involved, that is determined what she subconsciously associates with that particular situation. But as soon as this association is made, the conflict-related significant biological program is instantly activated. And the biological purpose of this biological program is to put her entire organism, so the organism as a whole, into a state that facilitates a conflict resolution. And this, my friends, is the new medical paradigm. This is what Dr. Hammer found. If more tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, the conflict-related organ will respond to the conflict with cell proliferation. So let's look, for example, at lung cancer. Well, the lungs, so Dr. Hammer discovered, identified, are linked to a death-fright conflict. Because in biological terms, the death panic is equated with not being able to breathe. So the moment that death fright occurs, the lung alveoli cells, which are in charge of processing oxygen, will immediately start to proliferate and to multiply, forming lung nodules or a lung cancer. And the biological purpose of the lung cancer is to allow the individual or put the individual into a better position to cope with the death fright by increasing the capacity of the lungs. While we can suffer such death frights, or death frights can be suffered during any life-threatening situation. But as you probably understand, one of the most common death frights is a diagnosis shock, particularly a cancer diagnosis shock. So this brain scan here shows the impact of such a death fright conflict in the area of the brainstem that controls the lungs. In other words, every person who has lung cancer shows on the brain scan the impact in this particular area of the brain. In other words, it is from this area of the brain from where the lung cancer program, as we want to call it, is coordinated and controlled. So it is the death panic, it is the cancer fright, it is the cancer death panic, as I'd like to call it, that is the real reason why lung cancer is the most common cancer. And it has nothing to do with smoking. We're going to talk about toxins a little bit later. Conventional medicine calls such a lung cancer, these lung nodules, a malignant cancer or a malignant growth. But we have to realize that the term malignant used by conventional medicine is an artificial term that only indicates that the cell proliferation has exceeded an arbitrary limit. If the cell proliferation is below this limit, then the tumor is called benign. But if we learn to understand that a lung cancer is a meaningful biological process that has been successfully practiced for millions of years of evolution, then we also realize and learn to understand that the distinction between benign and malignant is actually pointless. So in German new medicine, we call the phase during which this meaningful cell proliferation takes place the conflict active phase. So other biological meaningful cancers, just like lung cancer, are, for example, colon cancer, liver cancer, pancreas cancer, kidney cancer, uterus cancer, prostate cancer, and glandular breast cancer, to name a few. And we're going to talk, of course, later in more details about the glandular breast cancer. And Dr. Hammer also found that this meaningful cell proliferation, in other words, these significant biological programs of these specific types of cancer, are all controlled exclusively from the so-called old brain. And Dr. Hammer found that the exact opposite principle is the case with all organs and tissues that are controlled from the cerebrum. So the point is, or the principle is, if less tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, the conflict-related organ will respond to the shock, to the conflict, with tissue loss. So the opposite of cell proliferation. So let's look at an example. And this is always good it's very, obvious how we can explain this. Let's look at the cervix. The cervix is the passageway to the uterus. And Dr. Hammer found that the cervix, or the conflict linked to the cervix, is a sexual conflict of not being able to mate. While in nature a female can suffer such a conflict if mating is interrupted or doesn't take place for one or the other reason. Well, if this is the case, the cervix, the passageway to the uterus, immediately starts to ulcerate, causing tissue loss. And the biological purpose of the tissue loss is to widen the cervix, so when mating finally takes place, more sperm can reach the uterus, which enhances the chance of conception. Dr. Hammer found that we women, or women in general, can suffer these conflicts as well. So for us, this translates, for example, into sexual rejection, sexual frustration, sexual abuse, or anything shocking in regards to sexuality. So we see that tissue loss serves the purpose to facilitate the conflict resolution. With other biologically meaningful tissue loss programs are linked to our skin, for example, to the stomach lining, to the lining of our bronchial tubes, to the bile duct lining, the lining of the pancreatic ducts, thyroid ducts, and milk ducts, just to name a few. This is what we call the biological compass of German new medicine. And let's look at that. Look what we have already learned. We learned that all brain-controlled tissue generate, during the conflict-active phase, cell augmentation, cell proliferation, let's say as in form of a tumor. While all cerebrum-controlled tissue or new brain-controlled tissue generate during the conflict-active phase a meaningful, so biologically purposeful tissue loss or cell loss. This takes us now to the second biological law. The second biological law states that every biological special program, you see we don't use the term disease any longer, we call this a biological program. So the second biological program states that every disease or every special program runs in two phases, provided there is a resolution to the conflict. And as we already learned, this program runs parallel on all three levels, and the level of the psyche, the brain, and the organ. So let's see how this all plays out as far as our nervous system is concerned. So let's look what we see here. Before we have a DHS, before we have a conflict shock, our nervous system, or we are in a state of normotonia. Normotonia means that we are in a normal day and night rhythm where sympathikotonia alternates with vagotonia. These are terms that relate to our autonomic nervous system, and all it says is that during the day we are sympathicotonic, our heart rate is up, our muscles are going, we are in a normal state of stress. After 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we go into natural or normal vagotonia, which is the time where our mind, our body needs to rest. We're in a natural state of rest. And Dr. Hammer found the moment we suffer a DHS or a conflict shock, this normal day and night rhythm is instantly interrupted, and we enter what we call the conflict active phase, which is a prolonged sympathicotonic state, a prolonged state of stress. And when we resolve the conflict, CL stands for conflictolysis or conflict resolution, we enter the healing phase or a prolonged state of vagotonia, a prolonged state of rest. So let's look into more detail. Well, we have all been there many, many times. Typically, when we are conflict active, we are totally preoccupied with the conflict. We can't think of anything else. We can't focus on anything else. All we do is to dwell and think about what took place. So we are totally preoccupied with the conflict. We can't sleep and we can't eat. But we have to realize that the extra waking hours of waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and start thinking about the conflict, and that this focus on the conflict and the extra waking hours serve the biological purpose or have the significance to give us enough time or extra time to think about the conflict and find a resolution as quickly as possible. We call the conflict active phase also the cold phase, because when we're in the state of stress, our blood vessels are constricted, and as a result, we have cold hands, we have cold extremities. So typically all cold symptoms like the shivers or cold sweats only occur during the conflict active phase. Well, the moment we resolve the conflict, we enter the healing phase. Okay? So typically, when we are healing, we are very tired. Fatigue is always an indication that a natural healing process is taking its course. The healing phase is a vagotonic, a prolonged vagotonic state. It is, in simple terms, like resting after a big battle. So we are very tired, and there is a biological purpose. And the reason why we are very tired, because we need to rest, we need to sleep as much as possible so we can support the organism, the body, while healing takes place. So let's see. Warm phase, very important. We call the healing phase also the warm phase because the blood vessels are widened. Okay? Now we have hot hands, we have fever potentially, so all the hot symptoms, including inflammation, typically occur during the healing phase. So let's look now what happens on the healing phase, in the healing phase on the organ level, and this is most fascinating. The moment the conflict is resolved, all tumors or a tumor that grows during the conflict active phase instantly stops growing. But not only that, the moment the conflict is resolved, the tumor not only stops growing, but the tumor is now decomposed and broken down with the help of specialized microbes that have been trained over the course of evolution to do exactly that. And this takes us to the fourth biological law and the beneficial role of microbes. When our body, our organism developed over time, microbes developed with our organism. And the biological purpose or the function of the organism is to maintain our tissue and keep our body in a healthy state. And Dr. Hammer made two other important discoveries. Dr. Hammer found that these microbes that populate our organism are only active during the healing phase. So during the conflict active phase, they are dormant, they are inactive. But the moment the related conflict is resolved, the microbes instantly start the work that was assigned to them. Because Dr. Hammer also found that the manner and the style in which these microbes work are in full accordance with evolutionary logic. And this is what he found. He found that fungi, like Candida albicans, we're all aware of them, like fungi or mycobacteria like tubercular bacteria are the oldest microbes. So consequently, they only populated the oldest tissue that is controlled from the oldest part of the brain. And the moment the organ-related conflict is resolved, these fungi and TB bacteria begin to remove the tumor. In other words, these fungi and TB bacteria have been trained over the course of evolution to remove the tumor. In order to understand this even better, we have to realize the following. The tumor that grows during the active phase, like a lung tumor, like a colon tumor, like a liver tumor. So a tumor that grows during the conflict active phase consists of what we would call disposable cells. Because these cells are only meant to be there for the time being. They're only there to facilitate a conflict resolution and in fact improve the function of the organ during the conflict active time. And these disposable cells, they look in size and in shape different from the original cells, and that is important. because the tubercular bacteria, they recognize them as different and decompose only those. In fact, it gets even better than that. In fact, the moment we have the conflict, the moment the DHS occurs, the tubercular bacteria multiply parallel to the tumor growth. The TB bacteria, they multiply at the same rate as the tumor grows, so that when the conflict is resolved, there will be the sufficient amount of bacteria available to decompose the tumor. So now, of course, we are seeing symptoms. Okay? During the conflict active phase, there's never a symptom. There is a tumor, there is a growth, but we will never hear about people with a liver tumor or a lung tumor or so forth that they have any pain or anything. They don't feel the tumor at all. Okay? But this changes the moment the conflict is resolved and the person goes into healing. Because the remnants of the tumor, the remnants of this decomposing process have to be eliminated, causing discharge. So tubercular discharge is therefore typically expelled when a lung cancer is in healing. It is expelled through the sputum. When a colon tumor is being removed and decomposed, the discharge and the tubercular discharge is then in the stool. If a kidney tumor or a prostate tumor is being removed, the tubercular discharge is in the urine. Often this decomposing process and breaking down the tumor process, so to speak, is accompanied with blood loss. There is potentially blood in the discharge, because we have to realize it is as I like to call it, a construction site. And these small capillaries, they break easily, causing bleeding. Of course, bleeding also always has to be watched, but how important it is to understand that all this, when there's blood in the discharge, is a part of a healing process that is taking place. Another typical symptom that occurs in the healing phase when tubercular bacteria are involved are night sweats. So if there is a big tumor that has to be decomposed, these night sweats can be excessive. So again, how important is it to know that night sweats are not a bad sign? On the contrary, we now know that there is a healing process underway and that tubercular bacteria are in the picture. Okay? So if we don't have the tubercular bacteria, if we don't carry the TB bacteria or the fungi because of an overuse of antibiotics, what is the consequence? The result, as a result of not carrying these bacteria or fungi, the tumor cannot be decomposed and encapsulates. And such an encapsulated tumor can, as you can imagine, be found years later through a routine checkup. For example, through a lung x-ray, a mammogram, a colonoscopy, and so forth, right? And then, of course, it can cause new shocks, it can cause cancer shocks, and as a result, new cancers. So it is important what the biological process here is, and that we realize why the tumor cannot be decomposed. So what we also have to realize is that healing always occurs in a fluid environment. So there's always swelling, there is also edema in the area that is in the healing process. So we see swelling during the healing phase. Swelling typically causes pain. Easily, there can be inflammation during the healing phase, and fatigue and fever. So if we look at all these symptoms, discharge, pus, night sweat, swelling, pain, inflammation, fever, fatigue, we usually think that something is wrong, that we are sick. But it's quite the opposite is the case. Something is perfectly right, and we are now in a healing process, in a natural healing process. So people often ask me, so what is GNM therapy? Well, my friends, the symptoms, the pus, the discharge, the night sweat, the swelling, the pain, and the inflammation is already the natural healing that is taking place. And as Dr. Hammer puts it so beautifully, if the patient has been made aware of all the facts, He will no longer need to get frightened by his symptoms. He can now fully accept these as the healing symptoms they are, all of which had until now caused fear and panic. In the greatest number of cases, the whole episode will pass without any serious consequences. So the role of the GNM practitioner is to assist the patient during the healing phase, during the healing process, right? To assist him. A German new medicine practitioner will know how to support the healing process without interfering in it. Also, by understanding the entire process, gentle interventions can be planned in order to slow down a severe healing phase or more intense healing phase, and on top of it, potential complications can be anticipated and can be addressed before they reach a critical point. Well, with the patient and the doctor, the practitioner working together, this healing phase can in fact be a life-affirming experience for both of them. So let's look now from what we have learned to the so-called immune system. So let's look about the immune system based on Dr. Hammer's discovery that cancer is not a malignant disease but a meaningful biological process, and that microbes are in fact beneficial as they help us in the healing phase, in this case, as we learned, to decompose a tumor. Well, what is the immune system? According to conventional medicine, the immune system is a defense system against microbes and cancer cells. Thus, according to the theory, a weak immune system increases the risk of infectious diseases, we hear this all the time, and of developing cancer. Well, medical science views the immune system, or views, I should say, our body as a battlefield where white blood cells are ready to attack the enemy. In fact, daffodils are now, symbolically of course, also turned into weapons in order to fight cancer. But my friends, if we learn to understand that cancer is a meaningful process, that microbes are our loyal helpers, then the entire construct of an immune system falls apart. There is no immune system. The immune system does not exist. What exists, however, is a perfect biological system created to support us while we are healing. And that includes the supportive function of white blood cells, of antibodies, and many other biochemical processes. You see, Dr. Hammer puts everything on its head. Because if we learn that diseases are meaningful, that these are programs that have been practiced over millions of years, we realize that most theories of conventional medicine are based on assumptions that have actually never been substantiated. So let's look further. So what have we learned? We learned that all brain control tissue cause cell augmentation during the conflict active phase, causing the certain tumors to develop. And during the healing phase, these tumors are decomposed with the help of tubercular bacteria or fungi only, exclusively with those type of bacteria. And we learned that all new brain control tissue generates a meaningful tissue loss in order to facilitate a conflict resolution. So let's see what happens now on the organ level of these tissues that cause tissue loss during the active phase. Remember, we talked about the cervix related to a sexual conflict that causes during the active phase tissue loss and widening of the cervix in order to facilitate the conflict resolution. So let's see what happens during the healing phase. Well, the moment the conflict is resolved, the tissue loss, in other words, the ulcerated area, is refilled and replenished with new cells. And it is this cell proliferation that is now diagnosed as a cancer. Because of the cell proliferation, it is diagnosed as a malignant cancer. So here we find, for example, cervical cancer, right, as a healing phase of the cervix in healing as a result of having resolved a sexual conflict. But Dr. Hammer clearly shows that the cell proliferation is nothing malignant, that such a tumor is not malignant at all, but this tumor is in fact a good sign that the tumor is now in the healing process, that the tissue loss is refilled and replenished. So nothing malignant about this, and because of the healing nature of these tumors, Dr. Hammer calls this type of tumors a curative cancer or curative cancers. Other curative cancers of this type, a bronchial cancer, lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, ovarian cancer, testicular cancer, intraductal breast cancer, but also we find here skin rashes, bronchitis, laryngitis, hemorrhoids, and many other conditions that are basically organs controlled from the new brain, and they are all linked to very specific type of conflicts that Dr. Hammer has discovered. And of course, typically in the healing phase again, we see swelling, there is typically pain, potentially inflammation and fever, and of course also fatigue. Again, all signs that a natural healing is taking place. So one important point to point out is the following, that the cell proliferation, so refilling the tissue loss during the healing phase, only takes place during the first phase of healing. After the so-called epileptoid crisis, which I will explain in a moment, the tumor basically degrades and slowly degrades and calcifies. And at the end of the program, the tumor is basically gone, and all we see is scar tissue and often also scar tissue on the psyche, if I may say it this way. Okay, we're going to go to the brain level and see how these programs run on the brain level. We have learned that on the psychological level, during the conflict active phase, we are preoccupied with the conflict, we can't sleep, we can't eat, right? We are totally focused on the conflict. On the conflict-related organ, we see either a tumor growth or tissue loss, depending what tissue is involved, in order to help us on the organ level to cope with the conflict and facilitate a conflict resolution. So let's see what happens on the brain level. Well, during the active phase, all we see is on a CT scan the sharp target ring configuration in the area of the brain that is involved. Physically, so on the brain level as such, physically, there is absolutely no symptom. But this changes immediately when we go into healing, because healing also occurs now on the brain level. And as we learn, healing always occurs in a fluid environment, so the same applies to the brain. So during the first part of healing, there is water and serous fluid drawn to the area in the brain that is in healing. And this fluid, this serous fluid and water that accumulates at this area causes or creates a so-called brain edema. Okay. So this brain edema, however, is important because the edema provides basically a water pocket, a water cushion that protects the area in the brain while it's healing. So we have to realize that such an edema is not only in the area of the brain that is in healing, but also on the corresponding organ or tissue that is in healing at the same time. So that is why the phase A of healing is the most difficult part, because this is where there is the swelling and the pain on the organ level, and the brain edema causes the typical cerebral healing symptoms like headaches, dizziness, and blurry vision. But you can imagine the more intense the conflict active phase, the bigger the impact in the brain in the active phase, the bigger is the brain edema. And this is a very good picture. On the brain scan, the brain edema shows as dark, as black. This is a very good example. Well, at the height of the healing phase, a very important event takes place, which is the so-called epileptoid crisis. So what is that? Well, at the height of the healing phase, the brain from that area that is in healing, so from the center of here, the brain triggers a sympathicotonic spike that puts the entire organism back into conflict activity, with the typical symptoms like shivers, the cold sweats, nervousness, restlessness. So what is the reason for that? What is the purpose of that? Well, nothing in nature happens by chance. The biological purpose is the following. At the height of the healing phase, or we can also say at the deepest point of vagotonia, this brain edema has reached its maximum size. And exactly at this point, this sympathicotonic stress push presses the edema out. And that is a very important counter-regulation, because now the edema on the brain, on the brain level, and as well as the edema on the healing organ can now be expelled. So, well, after the epicrisis, we have therefore a urinary phase, which means that now the water can be expelled and we pee a lot. So we can now basically verify this from now on. So if all of a sudden we have a night where we get up and have to go to the washroom a couple of times, although we haven't drank a lot the morning before, okay? So that is when such an epicrisis has taken place. Usually often the epicrisis takes place in the early morning hours, because this is when we are in natural vagotonia, and this is, of course, the ideal time for the epicrisis. Epicrisis can manifest itself in different ways. Typical epicrisis symptoms, or events, I should say, are heart attacks, strokes, asthma attacks, migraine attacks, epileptic seizure, and as we of course understand, all these type of crises, of epicrisis, are linked to very specific organs and therefore to very specific type of conflicts. And that's why I said before, the GNM practitioner that is familiar and works with Dr. Hammer's work, who is, has studied it, will know exactly what type of epicrisis can be expected, and we can, anticipate this and take steps to hopefully prevent this as much as possible if it's a big epicrisis that we're waiting for. But we have these epicrisis events quite often in a small version, absolutely. So let's look now what happens in the healing phase. Well, as soon as the brain edema is pressed out, glia cells, so-called neuroglia, moves to the area in the brain that is being repaired and finishes the repair job. So you can imagine, if there is a long conflict active phase with a big brain impact in the brain causing a large brain edema, there is a lot of repair work that has to be done. So a lot of glia will accumulate at the site. And it is this accumulation of glia, it is these glia pockets that conventional medicine diagnoses or labels as a brain tumor. And Dr. Hammer has established and demonstrated already in the early 80s that such a brain tumor is not at all a malignant growth. On the contrary, what Dr. Hammer shows and what we already clearly understand is that such a brain tumor indicates a healing process on the brain level parallel to the healing on the corresponding organ. Okay? So whenever there's healing going on the organ level, from a common cold to hemorrhoids to a cancer, we see during phase B of healing, these clear pockets in the brain if a brain scan is taken. And of course, the size of these so-called brain tumors is determined how intense the program is. And just a couple of sentences here. This shows us the preventive aspect or value of German new medicine. Because now that we know when we are conflict active, because we have the cold hands, we are preoccupied with the conflict, we wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and start thinking of it. Now we know it's time, I should resolve this conflict as soon as possible. If we are constrained because we can't leave our workplace, we can't leave a difficult relationship, we should try, as we call it, to downgrade the conflict. Downgrading means to minimize the conflict mass, because remember, the psyche, the brain, and the organ work as one unit. And it is the psyche that is the leading component of the unit. So if we downgrade this emotionally and psychologically, then the program will be lighter, so to speak, not as intensive, and we can prevent more difficult healing phases and healing symptoms. Okay, next. Okay, what have we learned? This is basically how we can summarize the fifth biological law. The fifth biological law states that every so-called disease is part of a significant biological program created to assist the organism in coping with a biological conflict. Okay? So what did we learn? We learned that all old brain control tissue cause cell augmentation in the active phase. The tumor is broken down during the healing phase. All new brain control tissue cause a meaningful tissue loss, which is refilled and replenished during the healing phase. How come? What is the reason why certain tumors, certain cancers grow during the conflict active phase of all old brain control tissues, so in the active phase, and other tumors basically develop during the healing phase when the organ is controlled from the new brain? And Dr. Hammer found the answer in the science of embryology, and we're going to look at this now. This is a beautiful quote. The science of embryology and our knowledge of the evolution of man is the foundation of medicine. They are the two sources that reveal to us the nature of cancer and of all so-called diseases. So let's look at this in more details. This is absolutely fascinating. This is a blastocyst. A blastocyst contains a cluster of cells from which the embryo develops. On the 13th day after conception, in other words, 13 days after the fertilization of the egg, the blastocyst divides into 3 embryonic germ layers, which is the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. And it is from these 3 germ layers from which all our organs and tissues developed. In fact, we have to point out and realize that when the fetus develops in the womb, or the fetus develops, that the fetus passes all the evolutionary stages from a single-celled organism to a complete human being. And we're going to look at this now in details. Okay, the endoderm develops all the organs of the intestinal canal or the alimentary canal from the mouth to the rectum. The endoderm also develops the liver, the pancreas, the lungs, the prostate, and the uterus. From an evolutionary point of view, the endoderm is the oldest germ layer. And that is why all organs and tissues that derive from the endoderm are controlled from the oldest part of the brain. And all these tissues that derive from the endoderm and are controlled from the oldest part of the brain are the same cell type. They are all so-called adenocells. And in full accordance with evolutionary logic, All organs that derive from the oldest germ layer relate or are linked to the oldest biological conflicts. Conflicts that relate to breathing, procreation, and food, literally or figuratively. And what we have learned is that all organs that are controlled from the brainstem, they generate exclusively cell augmentation or a tumor growth during the conflict active phase. And during the healing phase, the tumor is broken down with the help of mycobacteria and fungi that are the oldest microbes that populated the oldest tissue that is controlled from the oldest part of the brain and that derives from the oldest germ layer. See, we have a system. The mesoderm develops our underskin, the corium skin, the skin underneath the epidermis. It also develops the breast glands, the pleura, the ovaries, the testicles, the spleen, bones, muscles, and other tissue. And all tissues and organs that originate from the mesoderm are controlled from either the cerebrum or from the cerebral medulla, which is the interior part of the cerebrum. At a later time during evolution, we developed a second skin, which is the epidermis, which covers entirely the underskin. And the skin, the epidermis, derives from the ectoderm. The skin consists of squamous epithelial tissue. And over the course of evolution, the squamous epithelial tissue also migrated into the mouth and into the rectum. It lined all the canals and ducts in our system. It lined the pancreas ducts and the bile ducts. It lined the stomach and so forth. And being the youngest tissue type that derives from the youngest germ layer, all these organs and tissues that derive from the ectoderm are exclusively controlled from the youngest part of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex. And accordingly, these tissues relate to more advanced biological conflicts like separation conflicts, territorial conflicts, identity conflicts, and so forth. And all these tissues, as we have learned, they generate a meaningful tissue loss during the conflict active phase, which is refilled and replenished during the healing phase. So Dr. Hammer's discoveries, as we so beautifully see, they provide us with a complete biological system that explains not only the cause, but also the natural healing of diseases in the context of how our organism developed over time. And the beautiful thing is that this complete biological system does not only apply to us humans. All species, whether fish, reptile, mammal, or humans, respond to the same type of biological conflict with the same biological program. In other words, every species responds to a death-fright conflict with the proliferation of lung cells. Every mammal responds, or female mammal, responds to a nest worry conflict with the proliferation of breast gland cells. Last thing before the quick break. Based on what we have learned, based on that cancer and diseases are not something out to kill us, right? If nature were designed to produce cancer cells in our body to kill the organism, we would not be sitting here, right? So let's look from that new understanding, based on this new paradigm, to the question if toxins can, in fact, cause cancer. While the theory that toxins cause cancer is a widespread belief, and it also causes a lot of fear, adding to the fear that is already associated with cancer. While this does not say, or we are not suggesting, that toxins are harmless. Toxins in our food, in our environment, environmental toxins, smoking, etc., of course deplete the body, deplete our organism of energy. which means that we are more susceptible to suffer a conflict shock, and also a body depleted of energy has a much more difficult time to in the healing phase. There are also so-called neurotoxins that are in dental fillings and in vaccines. And absolutely, this neurotoxin can cause severe nerve damage and neurological disorders. But, my friends, and this is the point, toxins cannot cause cancer. And this is why. The theory that toxins cause cancer is based on the assumption that cancer is a malignant disease. But if we learn that cancer is not malignant but a meaningful biological process, then we also understand that toxins can't cause cancer. Also, when we learn to understand that cancer originates in the psyche and that each cancer is controlled from a very certain area in the brain that acts as a mediator between the psyche and the body, then we also understand that toxins cannot cause cancer. Dr. Hammer's discoveries also explain why people that live a very healthy lifestyle, that follow a healthy diet, and try to stay away as much as possible from toxins still get cancer. And this often at a very early age. I know this is something to digest, but we just have to look at the science. Yes. In order to understand breast cancer, we have to take a closer look to the main tissues of the breast, which are the breast glands, the milk-producing glands, and the milk ducts that carry milk to the nipple. So let's look at the system, because that will explain to us why there are two different cancers, different breast cancers. Okay. The breast glands are the oldest tissue of the breast. Being the oldest tissue, remember what we just learned, originating from the mesoderm, the breast glands are controlled from the old brain, to be precise, from a specific area in the cerebellum. During the later time of evolution, the milk ducts were lined with a new cell layer, which is squamous epithelial tissue. And this new layer, this new tissue type, this new cell layer, being a younger tissue type, is controlled from the cerebral cortex from a very specific area. So what we can conclude here is the following. As far as breast glands and the milk duct lining is concerned, that these two tissues developed at different times during evolution, they derive from different embryonic germ layers, they consist of different tissue types, they are controlled from different parts of the brain, they relate to different biological conflicts, and therefore they cause different types of breast cancer. And we're going to start with the breast glands. The conflict that is linked to the breast glands is, as Dr. Hammer calls it, a nest-worry conflict. In nature, a female can suffer such a nest-worry conflict if her offspring is all of a sudden seriously sick or injured. If this is the case, the breast glands in the female breast will instantly start to multiply and to proliferate. And the biological purpose of the cell proliferation is to allow the female to produce more milk, and provide more milk for the offspring to speed up healing. And Dr. Hammer found that we women, that our breast glands, so to speak, respond the same way when we unexpectedly worry about a loved one. When a parent, one of our children, a partner, a dear friend, a sibling, is a reason of concern. And this is how this works in details. The moment this worry conflict occurs, the conflict impacts in the area of the brain, is specifically in the area of the cerebellum that controls the breast glands, And at this moment, the breast gland tissue or the breast glands immediately start to proliferate, forming a breast gland tumor or a breast cancer in the glands. And Dr. Hammer found that even if a woman is not breastfeeding, this age-old biological program is still set into motion because the female breast is synonymous for caring and nurturing. What we have to realize now is that during the conflict active phase, there are no symptoms. So a woman that has a glandular breast tumor that is in the active phase will detect the tumor either through breast self-examination or it will be detected through a mammogram. In any case, conventional medicine, or another point I want to make to clarify that, the size of the tumor, so the size of the glandular breast tumor is determined by the intensity and the duration of the conflict. In other words, the tumor is always proportional to how intense the conflict is. So the more intense the warring conflict, the faster and bigger the tumor grows. But so we have to realize again that it is, and I keep emphasizing that it is the psyche that is the driving or the leading component of the unit. So again, we cannot ask a woman not to worry, but as I said before, it is a very important step to downgrade the conflict. So to put the worry situation in perspective, to talk about it. The woman will notice she's less stressed out, she can sleep a little bit better, and she's not as preoccupied with the conflict, because that implies that now the conflict mass is less, which means the tumor is going to become smaller, because the psyche, the brain, and in this case, of course, the organ, the breast glands, always work in synchronicity. Because of the cell proliferation, conventional medicine labels such a glandular tumor as a malignant growth. But Dr. Hammer clearly shows us that there is nothing malignant about such a tumor, that this is not a malignant growth, but an age-old natural biological response, and no reason to panic. With German new medicine and with the knowledge of the 5 biological laws, my friends, cancer is no longer a mystery. A woman that has been worrying about a loved one for a longer period of time will not be surprised if she finds out that she has a breast gland tumor. She will now understand why she has the breast tumor. She will also understand why she has the tumor in the breast glands. And on top of it, she will understand why she has the breast tumor in her right or in her left breast, because we also have an answer for that. Well, Dr. Hammer found whether a woman has a tumor on her right or left breast is determined by her biological laterality. In other words, by her handedness. So this is not if a woman or if a person writes with the right or left hand. Here we're talking about the biological laterality, which is determined at the first cell divisions, at the moment of conception. The easiest way, or an easy way to determine our laterality, or to establish it, I should say, is the clapping test. So I ask you please to clap in your hands. Okay? Thank you. So the hand that is on top is the leading hand and determines or tells us if we are biologically right or left-handed. Okay? So if the right hand is on top, the person is biologically right-handed. If the left hand is on top, the person is biologically left-handed. And this is the rule. So please remember that. So where are the right-handers? Hands up. And left. Look at that. I know there's always more than we expect. Okay, so this is the rule. Please remember this now. A right-handed woman responds to a conflict with her children or her mother with the left breast, or we can say with the left side of the body. And she responds to a conflict with her partner, who is anybody who is not her mother or her children, so her friends, her siblings, even her father. Our father is our first partner, so to speak, our friends, so everybody who is not mother or children, okay, is on our right side. So a right-handed woman will respond to a worry conflict or a conflict in general over her partner, anybody who is not mother and children, with the left side, with the right side of the body. For left-handed, it is reverse. So for left-handed, the right side is the mother-child side, and the left side is the partner side. So why is it this way? Well, a right-handed woman like me, I would carry my child on the right side, so on the left side, so my right hand is free to do things, to operate. Okay, to work and do things. So my mind, let's call it my biological mind, associates the left side with my child. And Dr. Hammer found that this also applies to us right-handers, to our mother, and that the right side is our partner side. So this translates, as far as breast cancer is concerned, to the following. If a right-handed woman develops a breast cancer in her left breast, that indicates that she suffered or is still suffering, if it's still conflict active, a conflict or worry conflict in regards to her child. Okay, the child is sick, is in trouble, son is taking drugs, daughter get divorced with all sorts of trouble. So this would be on this side, mother is ill and so forth. But we want to keep one thing in mind. This does not say that if we are worried that we get a cancer. Okay? It's the other way around. When a woman has a glandular breast cancer, then we know that she suffered or is still suffering a worry conflict, and that the worry conflict is the underlying cause of the conflict. So we always start with the symptoms, because the symptom indicates what is happening on the emotional and psychological level. Okay? So the good news is, with this wonderful new medicine, is that a woman not only knows now, you women here, not after an hour and a half, we learn that we now understand why a woman gets breast cancer to begin with, why the breast cancer is in the breast glands, and why the breast cancer is in the right or left side, right or left breast. But a woman that knows German New Medicine will also prepared for the healing symptoms. And that is, of course, most important, because this is when we see symptoms, typically. As we learned in the conflict active phase, there are no symptoms whatsoever. There's no pain, there's no nothing. It's just the woman might detect this, as I said, through self-examination and so forth. Well, we want to understand the following. It is the psyche where cancer, or breast cancer specifically here, originates. So it is the psyche where cancer originates. So it is in the psyche where cancer begins to heal. So let's see what happens during the healing phase. As we have learned with the fourth biological law, the moment the conflict is resolved, if the woman carries tubercular bacteria, then the tumor will be broken down and decomposed. Okay? So that is, I like to call it a construction site. There is a lot of decomposing and breaking down the tumor cells, causing potentially discharge, and this discharge can penetrate the skin. It is a foul-smelling discharge. It is literally a decomposing process. And this foul-smelling discharge can penetrate the skin, and if a woman is not prepared for that, it might scare her. But if she knows Dr. Hammer's work in German New Medicine, she will understand that this is a positive sign that the tumor is now in the healing process and is being naturally removed. She will also realize, as I explained, when such a tumor is broken down, there could be blood in the discharge. Of course, I always emphasize blood loss has to be watched, but blood in the discharge is nothing to be scared about per se. It is part of what is going on in the breast as far as healing is concerned. The woman will not be surprised that she has night sweats. Such a decomposing and healing process of the glands, of the breast gland tumor, can take 4 to 6 months, okay, depending on the size of the tumor. So a woman who knows Dr. Hammer's work will be prepared that this might take a little while, a few months even potentially, and she will not get scared. She will be mentally prepared and ready for that. She will understand that the night sweats are part of that healing process as an indication that the TB bacteria are doing a great job. One thing that is most significant, and this, my friends, applies to all tumors that grow, or better, that are decomposed during the healing phase. So breast gland tumor, colon tumor, liver tumor, lung tumor, prostate, uterus tumor, and so forth. When the tubercular bacteria are breaking down the tumor, they produce a lot of tubercular secretion. This is what has to be expelled, right? In this case, through the breast, through the skin. So they produce a lot of tubercular secretion. And tubercular secretion is very rich in protein, which is now eliminated. So it is essential to supplement the protein loss, because protein deficiency can cause serious complications. So we have to supplement the protein loss through a protein-rich food. Essential in order to support healing, because we have, cancer patients that are on raw food diets, on juice diets, and all these things, and they get weaker and weaker and weaker, and the main reason is because they're missing proteins. So for us, when you have your night sweats, even if it's just one night, if it's 2 nights, make sure you get your proteins, because that gives us energy. And in a case when there is a big tumor that has to be decomposed, if this takes months, this protein supplementation is essential to make it successfully through the healing phase. As we also learned, healing always takes place in a fluid environment, so there will be a lot of swelling in the breast, it will be very painful. Okay, on top of it, the woman is very tired, which is significant. She has to be tired, because this is not the time to jump around and do crazy things. This is the time to lie down and rest as much as possible, so we can support the body and doing that important healing process. So that's why there's little energy, so we need to give the body as much as energy as possible. This puts a little question marks behind cleansing, right? Cleansing can be very demanding on the body, so we have to look exactly what we're doing here, because if a woman in this case, goes through an intense healing phase and the cleansing is wiping her out, this is definitely counterproductive. So the point is to give the body energy, good food, healthy food, organic food, right? We need to feed the body specifically with proteins in order to support that healing process. And of course, there's also mental support. There is emotional support. So this is when we all have to help out. So if we have a loved one who is going through a healing phase, through any healing phase, in this case we're talking about breast gland tumor healing, we have to support the loved one. And so it is good when the whole pack, as I like to call it, when the whole family and the friends learn this great work, so we can support each other, right? And encourage the person doing that healing process. And this is also the work of the German New Medicine practitioner. The German New Medicine practitioner provides an environment free of fear and panic. He or she is supporting the patient, the client, during the healing phase on the physical level if necessary, because healing is already running its own course, but support the client and the patient emotionally and mentally, okay? Because, as Dr. Hammer points out so well, the biggest complication for any healing phase and every cancer healing phase is fear and panic. Because with fear and panic, we had a presentation last few months ago at the planetarium about abandonment and existence conflict. So fear and panic causes water retention, right? And the water, usually the retained water, goes into the healing organ, and this causes more pain and more swelling. So fear and panic is physically and mentally difficult. So, and Dr. Hammer's beautiful work gives us that gift that we do no longer have to fear cancer. Okay, so we can prevent also further shocks. Well, we know this already, just to summarize it here. If the woman does not have the tubercular bacteria available or the fungi to remove the tumor will encapsulate and the tumor stays in place. So there is no night sweats, there is no inflammation, there's nothing. The tumor stays there. Okay? And as I said before, such an encapsulated tumor can be found years and or decades later with a mammogram. You hit 50 and then you get a letter from the provincial whatever, and they tell you have to take a mammogram, and boom, there's a cancer diagnosis of an encapsulated tumor that has been there for years. Okay? So it is important to understand all this, to have this information before we have any symptoms. And this does not only relate to breast cancer, because we know how to take it. Okay? And a woman can live with such an encapsulated tumor for the rest of her life. Women cannot die of breast cancer. What should a woman die of? The extra cells? No. They don't kill. Okay? It's the fear, it's the panic, it's other conflict shocks that are added that involve vital organs, ducts can occlude, bile ducts with an anger conflict and so forth. Okay? All right, we go a little bit further. Because what happens, I go back for a second, if the healing phase becomes chronic, in other words, the woman has the TB bacteria, but the healing goes on and on and on and on. Of course, the tumor needs a certain time to be removed and decomposed, but this can take longer than it usually should. And the reason is the following. In order to understand why a condition, this in general, and of course of breast cancer particularly tonight, we have to understand what we call in German new medicine tracks. So conflict, relapses, triggers, and tracks. Sounds like a good movie title. Okay, so what happens here? The moment we have such an unexpected conflict shock, our mind is highly alert. And highly alert, our mind picks up all the components that surround the conflict, like the location where the conflict takes place, the people involved, sounds, anything that our mind associates or finds significant in association with this conflict situation. Right? And this, we call in new medicine these components that come basically with the conflict shock, we call them tracks, because we can say, like train tracks, we can say that the biological programs runs on tracks established at the moment of the DHS. So it runs on these tracks. But the biological purpose of the tracks is there's a reason for that. The biological purpose of the tracks is to be a warning signal, an alarm signal, saying last time you were at this location, last time you saw this person, last time you went by this hospital, last time you saw this type of car, you had a conflict, so watch out and stay away. So if a person is in the healing phase and all of a sudden sets on one of these tracks, the conflict relapses, and this is and is reactivated, and this is the conflict relapse that interrupts the healing phase and therefore also prolongs it. Right? And we call this situation, when a healing literally hangs here, we call this as I said, hanging healing situation. And this is the reason for chronic conditions or reoccurring symptoms, including reoccurring cancers. So in the case of a glandular breast cancer that is in healing with all the pus and discharge and the decomposing process, every time the woman sets on a track because the worry conflict is reactivated or any other trigger, then this will go on and on and on. So it is important to be aware of what is happening here. In German New Medicine, it is essential to identify these tracks so that the healing phase can be finally complete. So what we also have to realize, and this is significant, that any supportive treatment on the organ level can only be successful if we also heal or complete the healing process emotionally and psychologically, because it is the psyche that is the driving component of the unit. So any treatment on the organ level can only be supportive to ease the pain, to slow down, if you want, an intensive healing process, but it is us, it is our mind, it is us, up to us and our work, so to speak, to complete the healing parallel, of course, also on the psychological level. Otherwise it goes on and on and on. But the fact is, my friend, in regards to, let's say, glandular breast cancer, even if the healing phase takes longer, right? It is essential that the woman knows that this is not a malignant disease, that this is not going to kill her. It just takes longer. Of course, it's draining on the system, but it is the attitude and the understanding that this is a healing process. It's like we have a wound and we always, injure it or scratch it and, oh my God, it's bleeding again. It's going to take 3 days longer. Okay? This is exactly the same thing. It just takes longer. But we, in this case, because we're talking biological conflicts and not an accident or anything, we have to work on it on the emotional level to complete the healing. Okay, we're doing well. Okay, we learned now the biological program of the breast glands. So let's look now at the lining of the milk ducts. We have learned breast gland cancer controlled from the cerebellum, linked to a nest worry conflict, the lining of the milk ducts, ectodermal tissue controlled from the cortex, and a different tissue type, a different biological conflict, and therefore a different type of breast cancer. Okay, so let's look at the conflict. The conflict that is linked to the lining of the milk ducts is, as Dr. Hammer calls it, a separation conflict. In this case, if that happens in nature, in this situation, a female is not worried about an offspring. In this case, there was a separation from the offspring because the baby, the offspring, is lost or had been killed. If this is the case, the lining of the milk ducts instantly starts to ulcerate, causing tissue loss. And the biological purpose of the ulceration in the milk ducts is to widen the ducts so that the milk that is no longer used can drain off easier, which prevents congestion of milk in the breast. We see again a very significant reason why there is tissue loss, just like we have learned with the cervix. And Dr. Hammer found that we women, or our breast, responds the same way if we experience, or if we have a conflict that a child, our mother, a partner, a spouse, a sibling, a dear friend was torn from our breast. So the biological, psychological feeling behind this, I can no longer nurture you, I can no longer care for you, you're torn off my breast, and the program runs its course. So how does it work? The moment the conflict occurs, the conflict impacts now in the area of the brain that controls the lining of the milk ducts, and the program is switched on. And during the conflict active phase, as we already learned, there is ulceration, so tissue loss in the milk duct lining. During the conflict active phase, when that occurs, a woman might not even notice it. If it's more intense, she might notice some pulling in the breast. However, if the conflict active phase is very intense and lasts over a long time, this ulcerated area, because of the tissue loss, there's tissue loss in the lining, so the tissue might contract. Okay, it's pulls together, it contracts, forming what is called serous knots. But conventional medicine diagnoses this as a cancer, although it's not even a tumor, although it's not even cell proliferation that is happening here. It is tissue loss, and the tissue pulls together, forming that knot. And the serous knots are treated, quote unquote, with mastectomy. So here's a screenshot from the website of the amputation of the cancered and serous breast. So we have to keep this in mind, what is happening here. And this is even more disturbing when we see what happens in the healing phase, when we see what happens when we allow the breast to heal. Well, when the separation conflict is resolved, the ulceration process stops. And the ulcerated area, so the tissue loss, is now refilled and replenished with new cells, with squamous epithelial cells. And it is the cell proliferation that occurs during the first phase of healing that is diagnosed as an intraductal breast cancer. So an intraductal breast cancer, my friends, is a curative breast cancer. It is a healing tumor as opposed to the glandular tumor that grows and develops during the conflict active phase as a result of a worry conflict decomposed in the healing phase. In this situation, in this case, the tumor is an event that occurs in the healing phase by refilling and replenishing the tissue loss that occurred during the conflict active phase. So a curative tumor. Typical symptoms, as we learned, there is swelling. It's a very good picture. There is swelling in the breast because healing always occurs in a fluid environment. So there is swelling that can cause a considerable amount of pain. We are in vagotonia. The woman is in vagotonia, in the warm phase. So the breast is hot, is red, and also can be itchy. So all these are positive signs that a natural healing process is going on. Conventional medicine, because of the cell proliferation, labels this tumor as malignant. But we see that this is not malignant, that nature is doing a very good job here. But we have a lot more things to say. The majority of breast cancers are in fact intraductal breast cancers linked to a separation conflict. And this should not surprise us. Why the majority of breast cancers are intraductal, it should not surprise us where breast cancer is, on the rise. When we look at the divorce rate, when we see what is going on out there, second family, third family, another divorce, and other separation. Separation conflicts, of course, can be caused by the death of a loved one, but also the fear of a separation, the fear of losing a loved one is already a reason why the program is switched on. And please, I'd like to emphasize again, it is a subjective event, okay? So not every divorce, not every loss of a loved one, not every argument that causes a fear of separation causes a breast cancer. We have to look at it from the other way around. If a woman has an intraductal breast cancer, then we know that this is a healing phase, that she is in the healing process of a separation conflict that has been resolved. resolved and that the tumor is now a healing tumor. And that's why we often see intraductal breast cancer when women come to terms naturally with the separation, when they found, let's say, a new partner, or when the separation, the unexpected separation, let's say, even grieving period is over, when couples reconcile, you say, right? Yeah, reconcile, sorry. Right? So this is when we can basically analyze this and say, well, it's good news, this is a healing process, the woman came to terms with that separation. Okay? Laterality, of course, has to be taken into account. So the good news is now we are in control of the situation. So a woman that finds out that she has a intraductal breast cancer, a right-handed woman, let's say in her right breast, right? She will know exactly why she has it. Because she realized, well, a year ago, 2 years ago, a few months ago, I had this breakup. I went through this separation with a partner, with a dear friend. My best friend moved away and she told me out of the blue, situations like that. And she goes into healing and she will realize what caused the cancer and that she is now in good shape, that she is in the healing process. Again, the healing phase can be difficult, it can cause pain, it can go on for a long time, but the point is, and the good message is, a woman can never ever die of an intraductal cancer. This is not a vital organ. There is not the heart or the bronchial tubes involved that can occlude, right? It's painful, it's difficult, but it can cause death, really. Okay? Of course, tracks have to be watched, okay, because it is the tracks again, seeing the ex-spouse going to the place, another relapse of the separation issue, and then the healing phase is prolonged. So again, important to identify the tracks. It is not difficult to identify the tracks because we know now what conflict is behind that, and the moment we set on the track, we have cold hands. Okay? So when we look for the tracks, we just always ask, okay, observe your daily routines and what you do during the day, and when you get emotional and when things sort of come back emotionally, and when we are on the track, we get the cold hands, and then we know that's the track. And now we have to find ways and strategies to neutralize them. And that's work, but it's good work because it's the first step to complete the healing process. Naturally, such milk ducts are narrow, so they can easily cause, the tumor can easily cause inflammation in the breast, and this is then called an inflammatory breast cancer. According to conventional medicine, one of the most aggressive and most deadly. Well, all it is really is that there's inflammation in the breast, now treated as one of the most aggressive cancers. Okay, let's keep going. So we learned now that the intraductal breast cancer develops during the phase A of healing, right? This is where the swelling is, there's the edema and the water, this is in phase A. And during the epicrisis, remember what we learned, there's this sudden stress push that that presses the edema out, so there is the water in the breast is pressed out, followed by the urinary phase. And after the epicrisis, the tumor slowly degrades. And some of you might have read those studies, right? The study from Norway, some breast cancers may clear up without treatment. Well, my friends, Dr. Hammer has been talking about this for over 20 years. Right? So we understand now what that implies. It means they clear up without treatment because it's already in healing anyhow, and it goes into this phase, into phase B. Okay? What happens in phase B? Well, as soon as the water is pressed out here, during the epicrisis, the tumor, as we just learned, slowly degrades and calcifies. So during phase B, we see microcalcification. On a mammogram, this microcalcification is visible as white specks. But hold on to your hats, because conventional medicine diagnoses these white specks as a cancer. New York Times, June 22, 2004. The diagnosis of ductal carcinoma in situ, a non-invasive lesion of the lining of the milk ducts, has increased markedly in recent years. As a result of the widespread use of mammography. In 1983, the condition was diagnosed in 4,800 women. 2 decades later, the number has soared to more than 50,000, with the vast majority of the lesions detected as microcalcifications on mammograms. And how is the microcalcification treated? With mastectomy. Okay? Mastectomy is an effective treatment for a widespread or malignant appearing microcalcification throughout the breast. My ladies, we have to be on top of this. Okay? We see what's out there and we have to protect ourselves. With German New Medicine, my friends, the mutilation of women and the war on cancer with chemical and radioactive weapon is over. So why, we might ask, is Dr. Hammer's work not taught in medical schools? Why are not patients all over the world treated based on his discoveries? Why is this not common knowledge? Well, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background information. In 1981, Dr. Hammer submitted his findings, his discoveries, to the University of Tübingen as a postdoctoral thesis. But in spite of its legal obligation, the University of Tübingen and the medical faculty of Tübingen refuses to this day to evaluate Dr. Hammer's discoveries. So in 1986, Dr. Hammer took the medical faculty and the University of Tübingen to court. And in court, the judge asked the dean of the medical faculty why they don't test Dr. Hammer's discoveries. And this is what the dean said: "We don't want to know whether Hammer is right." Shortly after, Dr. Hammer was stripped of his medical license on the grounds that he did not revoke his discoveries. In other words, Dr. Hammer lost his medical license, although his discoveries have never been disproved. To this day, Dr. Hammer has been persecuted, and all his wonderful discoveries, this valuable knowledge, has been systematically suppressed by the authorities. Millions of lives could have been saved over the last 23 years, including lives of our loved ones. And this is how Dr. Hammer puts it: "We are fighting a crime committed on patients all over the world." So now we're going to talk about metastasis. Okay? And we're going to start with the same slide we started out with, which shows so beautifully Dr. Hammer's discovery of the correlation between the psyche, the brain, and the organ. Remember what we learned? Each cancer is controlled from a very specific area in the brain, linked to a very specific conflict that correlates biologically to the same conflict, that area of the brain that controls the cancer. Well, what does the metastasis theory say? According to the metastasis theory, a cancer, so a primary cancer, let's say in the breast, breaks away from the tumor and spreads via the lymph system or the bloodstream to other parts of the body where it causes a new growth. Well, let's take a closer look, and let's first of all just ask some common sense question. Well, if it were true that cancer spreads through the bloodstream, then we would have there would be a serious risk of contracting cancers by coming in contact with blood of a cancer patient. Okay? So we would also have to ask the question why donated blood is not screened for cancer cells. So we should ask the authorities the question why donated blood is not being screened. Also, if it is true that cancer cells travel or migrate via the bloodstream to other parts of the body, why is then cancer of the blood vessel, so to speak, not the most common cancer? Because on the journey to other parts of the body, such a cancer cell can get easily stuck at the wall of such an artery or a vein, or a blood vessel, I should say, and can cause a cancer there. And also, if it were true that cancer cells travel via the bloodstream, why is there no such thing as a cancer of the heart that is supplied with the biggest blood vessel, which is the coronary artery? Well, let's look at the lymph system argument here. Well, there's also a problem because there are quite a few tissues in our body that are not supplied with lymph fluid. For example, the bones. And bone cancer is the most most frequent secondary cancer. So the question is, how do the cancer cells get there if there is no lymph fluid? Also, there is the argument or of so-called brain tumors. So in other words, that there is a cancer cell that migrates to the brain, causing a brain tumor. But we have to keep in mind that we are equipped, so to speak, with the blood-brain barrier. You know what that is? The blood-brain barrier is a filter, a selective filter, that makes sure that no harmful substances get into the brain. So you can imagine if we have this protective filter that does not allow harmful substances to pass that barrier, why should cancer cells be allowed to do that? There's also another important argument. We never hear about brain tumor cells or brain cancer metastasizing to the body, right? We never hear about that. Based on the conventional medicine theory, this would translate into brain cells that should then be found in the breast, in the prostate, in the testicles, in the cervix, in the colon. Unheard of. Well, what we understand, of course, is that based on Dr. Hammer's discovery, secondary cancers are not caused by migrating cancer cells, but that secondary cancers are caused by further or secondary conflict shocks. Because we learned about the system here, and that each cancer is controlled from a very specific area in the brain. So under no circumstances can a cancer spread to a part of the body that is controlled from a completely different part of the brain. So and let's look at this with a couple of examples, okay, from what we have learned. We've learned that the intraductal breast cancer is the healing phase of a separation conflict. The lining of the milk ducts consists of squamous epithelial tissue, originates from the ectodermal germ layer, and is controlled from the cerebrum. A lung cancer, on the other hand, is a conflict-active phase, or the lung cancer, I should say, develops during the conflict-active phase. The lungs are endodermal tissue, they are adenocells, and they are controlled from a very specific area in the brainstem. And the conflict linked to the lung cancer is, as we learn, a death-fright conflict. So what is happening is the following. The moment a woman gets a breast cancer diagnosis and she has a death-fright conflict because she associates the cancer with a death sentence, it will impact in the area of the brain that controls the lungs, and then she develops lung cancer. So the time lapse between the diagnosis of the primary tumor and further tests is crucial, because it is during that time that the tumor grows. Okay? So routinely, when a person has cancer, any type of cancer, the person is sent for lung x-rays, right? And this is then if the person had a death threat, when they find a lung cancer, and then they're saying that the cancer is metastasizing. But the cancer is not metastasizing and says, well, I think I'm going to go to the lungs, or maybe I go somewhere else. I mean, this is obviously a new shock and a cancer that is controlled from an entirely different part of the brain. It's a different tissue, and it is a different phase. And the same applies to bone cancer. Okay? Bone cancer is the most frequent secondary cancer after lung cancer. So let's see what happens. The bones are controlled from the cerebral medulla, up here, from the cerebral medulla. They are of mesodermal origin. And the conflict is a self-devaluation conflict. So you can imagine if a woman gets a breast cancer diagnosis, she can truly have a self-devaluation conflict. A self-devaluation conflict means now I'm useless at this site, at this area. So that's why I put this picture here. Just the image, the idea of a mastectomy, the fear of a mastectomy can cause such a self-devaluation conflict, and the program is switched on. And during the conflict active phase, we have the tissue loss during the active phase causing bone cancer. Bone cancer, my friends, is by definition tissue loss. In other words, holes and gaps in the bone. And Dr. Hammer often shares this with us, that when he was a medical student, he had a hard time with this because he said, we always learned that a cancer is a growth. But in the case of bone cancer, all of a sudden it's not a growth, but it is a hole. It is a tissue loss. It is gaps and holes in the bones. So this would translate into the following scenario, and just follow the logic. This would translate into following, that a breast gland cells breaks away from the milk ducts, migrates all the way to the bone, and causes in the bone a hole. This is the logic. But what we also understand here, and we see that why this metastasis theory has so many contradictions and there's so many unanswered questions. But what we also understand is the following, that again, routinely, the woman is sent, in this case, the breast cancer patient, is sent for lung x-ray and for bone tests, right? And the bone cancer is typically found in the sternum or in the ribs, in the area where there is potentially, where there is the tumor, because this is where the self-devaluation conflict runs its course, and this is why they find the bone cancer in this area of the brain, of the bone. With German new medicine, all these conflict shocks, these diagnosis shocks, these secondary cancers of these types can be prevented because a woman understands why she has a breast cancer, she understands why it's in the ducts, she understands why it's in the glands, she understands why it's the right or left breast, she knows when it's active, she knows what it's healing. My friends, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we have to stop walking. We have to stop walking. And we have to educate ourselves. And we have to liberate ourselves from this kind of control. And with German new medicine, we are in control. We can live without a fear of cancer. Or to say it metaphorically, with German new medicine and Dr. Hammer's great gift to us, we can reclaim the daffodils and the color pink. Thank you.